So what I want to talk about today is just generally what is the cloud. So I just want to talk about the cloud and some key issues that, like briefly about the definition of the benefits, the kind of service models and the way that the cloud is deployed. Because it's all relevant to the way that we're going to tie this into Australian Privacy Principle number 8 that talks about the cross-border disclosure of data. So then I'm going to, that's the key privacy issue that I'm going to discuss, but there's other issues that it ties into. We're going to look at transparency, the notification obligation, the security obligation, and obviously cross-border. But the point that I want to say is that when you're using the cloud and when you're meeting your privacy compliance obligations, it covers more than one of the privacy principles. Then we're going to look at two core legal concepts, the concept of use versus the concept of disclosure. Because whether or not you are using data or disclosing data will affect whether or not you're subject to Australian Privacy Principle number 8, which has an accountability mechanism attached to it. So I've got a few examples as well that we'll talk through there. We're going to mention the benefits of the cloud, but I also want to mention some of the key risks of using the cloud. Then some contractual considerations, and then we're going to tie it all in through to just a summary at the end. So that's the journey that I'd like to go through. I'm not here to say you should or shouldn't use the cloud, but everybody uses data to drive their business. When we're using data, it needs to be stored somewhere. So whether or not we store it on servers or store it in the cloud, we need to be mindful about our data privacy obligations. Okay. A few words about the cloud, and starting off with the definition. There's many definitions available. This isn't a legal definition. This is just a research definition that I've selected to use. So, cloud is also a metaphor for the internet. So if you're using the internet, you're using the cloud. If you're using social media, you're using the cloud. It is the availability of infrastructure, applications, business processes delivered as a service over the internet. Furthermore, it's the way I understand it, it's internet-based storage of applications and files, and certainly the use of social media, which, to be honest, it wasn't until that I actually thought about it that I actually thought, oh my God, I'm putting data in the cloud every time I use LinkedIn, which I try to use as much as possible. And what it's using the cloud is, as I've said, it's the difference between having a hard physical server in the office and not. Paying for that server in your office or not. So it allows you to buy or rent space instead of having physical service around. Where you can only quite actually one, but we actually, some of our applications, they're not physically based simply because we'd rather use the space for other things. So examples of cloud, Google. Every time we go into Google and search a question, we're using the cloud. Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, Dropbox, Microsoft, all these, and every social media application. These are all cloud-based, but just bear in mind, every time we're in the cloud, every time we're on the internet, we're probably doing something within the cloud. I've got some pictures throughout the presentation that aren't my pictures, but if you Google cloud and certain derivations of the word cloud, there's fantastic pictures on the internet. So to try and just tie it together, we've got our remote servers that do sit somewhere, but we also have databases, desktops, we've got our mobile devices, our PCs, our smartphones, notebooks, etc. How do we access that data? Generally by the cloud. When we're using our virtual networks or remote access, it's via the cloud. So it's very important to understand that when we use the word cloud, we also use it's like it's synonymous with data interchange and sharing data. So there's a multitude of devices that are linked together. So we've got the data centre where all the data is housed. We've got workers at home, we've got remote access, we've got office workers. The only way we can thwart that data is to actually have open, efficient means to actually have it accessible. Some of the benefits, as I've said, is accessibility. It's very flexible, you can customise it to your own needs. It's very mobile, it is reliable, and security is a big issue, but it is a benefit as well. But it also ties in with one of the key risks. And also there's a price benefit. because, as I said, you're not paying for something physical to be sitting in your office or offices. You're not paying for buildings, the housing multitude of servers. So you're basically renting space or buying space. Now, the way the cloud is delivered, now I'm not going to give you a typical discussion about delivery models, but it's delivered by more than one process. There's three core processes. There's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And the reason why I've included these here and some examples is that it helps us particularise and understand further when we're using the cloud. So in a law firm I used to work in, we had this desktop, but there's no server. You just had your PC screen and your mouse and keyboard, and I'm like, where's my, little box? No, you've got a virtual desktop now. So they store the data somewhere securely, but then they image the data onto the desktop. So that is infrastructure as a service. So when the law firm would have engaged their cloud provider, they would have gone for an IaaS service. So they just, an example of that is Rackspace Cloud, where they can develop something like this. So then you've got platform as a service. What is that? That's the operating system that you may decide to acquire, and an example of that is Google App Engine or Windows Azure. Then you've got software as a service, and this is probably one that's more familiar to most of us, and that's where you're actually just contracting to use a software database like Salesforce. We're never going to use Salesforce, so our data is housed on Salesforce, but there's no server that actually has got physical data in it. So if you use Google Docs or Gmail, or when you're buying software on the internet, or you've got the license, you no longer need the physical disk, you just access that software via the cloud, and that's software as a service, and that's what you're paying for as a license agreement. So depending on whether or not, so whether or not you're developing the infrastructure, you're involved in the architecture, that's where it's infrastructure. If you're the app on the app side, then that's where the platform is, and certainly the end user, which is the customer-facing use of the data, that's where you're in the software as a service side. So the more practical one that we use on a day-to-day basis is obviously the software as a service facility. And this is just another slide that also it's got some keywords. If you're hosting the data, you're in the infrastructure space. If you're building the platform for the data, you're in the platform space. That's your applications. And then if you're actually using the software, that's when you're consuming the data. So that sort of tries and breaks it down a little bit more. When I was researching the key differences between these three, it can get quite complicated as to, and there are some similarities or overlaps between them. But so, and one of the last things that I talk about in terms of just demystifying what is and isn't the cloud is the way the cloud is delivered. You've got private cloud, and that's where, say, for example, ADMA would have its own cloud space. So there'd be a dedicated cloud space provided by one of the infrastructure providers, and it would only be accessible by ADMA. That's it. Then you've got the public cloud, and that's where you get things like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. That's where it's not just one individual accessing that data, but that's where it's pushed out. And then there's a combination of both. And if you decide to use a combination of both, well, you'll have some personal or sensitive data in your private cloud, and you're building under your public cloud. So it just depends on where you want to host the data and what fee is attached to that, and your contractual arrangements, and your concerns about security and data disclosure as to which one you would use. And this is just another awesome picture that I found that so you can look at the way the public-private interface works. Right, now, so using the cloud involves using data, and whether or not it's using the public cloud or the private cloud or infrastructure platform or software services will all tie into our data privacy obligations. Now there's 13 data privacy obligations, but the core ones that I've picked out that actually refer to offshoring of data or the use and disclosure of data that touch on cloud usage are APP 1, 5 and 8. APP 1, just to recap, is the broad-based obligation in terms of the open and transparent management of personal information. What that means is you have to document, or you have to have practices and procedures and systems in place that actually demonstrate how you're going to comply with all of the privacy obligations. That includes whether or not you'll be disclosing data offshore. If you're disclosing data, you are. And if you're disclosing data, then all of a sudden you've got these accountability provisions that kick in, not unless there's an exemption that applies to you. So I'll quickly just run through the accountability provisions. The way the APP reads, so if you see it on the Privacy Commissioner's website, on the website, you've got to take note that APP is read in conjunction with Section 16C of the Act. And what it does is that it makes the APP entity, the organisation that is subject to the Privacy Act, accountable for what happens to the data. The way that I describe data is that when you're filling in an application form, every little box, that's a piece of data. And what that means is that the APPs attach to every little box. So that, to me, is a very simplified way of understanding what my privacy obligations are. But what does it mean to be accountable? Well, if APP 8 applies, so if we're in a disclosure phase, then we need to ensure that the privacy principles continue to attach to that data. So any overseas recipient has to make sure that you, as the data collector, have to ensure that the APPs continue to apply, or that you're familiar with the laws of the jurisdiction that is sending the data, that the laws are substantially similar to the APPs, or that there's an adequate enforcement mechanism for consumers, because again, the APPs are about creating an obligation on organisations to protect the data, and consumers have a right of recourse. They need to know what's happening with their data. So if you're sending disclosing data offshore, you need to make sure that there is an enforcement mechanism. Or if you don't have, if you don't know if it's the law is substantially similar, if you don't know that there is an enforcement mechanism available to consumers, you need to get express consent. To get express consent from a consumer to disclose data offshore means that you have to say, dear Dad, I'm sending your data offshore. I don't know what the laws are. I'm not accountable. And by the way, there's no redress for you. And then you get my consent. What are the chances of somebody giving you that kind of express consent? Unlikely. I certainly don't recommend. Well, you can ask for it, but I don't know. It's not just consent that this is what we're going to do. It's actually stating your specific basic lack of control anymore, and the implications for the consumer, and then asking them to consent. So the express aspect is really emphasised with respect to APP 8. So just to recap, APP 8 does create accountability, and that accountability applies if you're disclosing data, but you can do it if the laws are substantially similar, there's an enforcement mechanism, or you express consent. They're the exceptions of the APP 8. So unless you can satisfy yourself that you understand that the laws are substantially similar, that you understand that there's an enforcement mechanism, or that you've obtained consent, then unless you can do that, then you're still subject to APP 8 and you're accountable. So APP 8, going back, is about looking at the difference between use and disclosure. If we're disclosing data, it's not disclosing data to any entity, it is disclosing data to an overseas entity. So what's an overseas entity? Basically, the overseas entity is the entity that receives the data. The entity is not in Australia, it's not the entity itself, and it's certainly not disclosing the data back to the individual themselves. So we've got to think about if this is more relevant to larger organisations, I suppose, but even so, smaller organisations that use that contract services overseas, it's still relevant. So, if we're using data, we're not subject to the accountability provisions of ADMA. If we're disclosing data, we are. So on this slide, I've got a few examples of what the difference is between use and disclosure. And it's really important that we look, if we're using the cloud or wherever you're housing your data or the security provisions that you're taking, or if we're using contracted service providers, that we understand the difference between use and disclosure. You can have a use on its own, so any type of formatting of data, but you can't have a disclosure of data without use. So, what is use? Routing data just through a server, even if the server is located overseas, that's just a use. Using personal information by overseas offers, again, because that's still the same entity, that's use. Any type of handling of data, but it's still under your effective control, is a use. So when you're storing data in the cloud, as long as your contracts, you look at your contracts, and you're satisfied with the provisions in your contracts, that is use. In some instances, using a contractor located overseas, depending on the services that they're providing, and depending on whether or not you're retaining effective control, that too can be a use. What's a disclosure? And this is really important because this is when we're subject to ADMA and the accountability provisions kick in. Sending data to an overseas recipient. So you've got to look at whether the recipient is, who are they related to my company or not, is it an overseas office? Sending data to a related body corporate can be a disclosure. Any form of making data available to others or accessible to others where you don't have effective control is a disclosure. Sending hard copy or even by email to overseas clients is a disclosure. Reviewing data at an international conference, so for those of us that or a meeting overseas, so if you're for some reason needing to use data during an overseas conference, reviewing that data is also a disclosure. Publishing data on the internet. Even if it's not accessible by an overseas recipient, and that's because of the things that I touched on earlier. And also, the last one is providing data to a contractor that's located overseas. One of the biggest grey areas is effective control, what is and isn't effective control, and also using a contractor that's located overseas. The core mechanisms here is looking at who can manipulate the data and also looking at the terms of your contract. And that will help you form a reasonable view as to whether or not you've got effective control of that data. It's not a defined legal term. Okay, what are the key risks? The most obvious, obviously, is the data privacy. Knowing where the data is located and how the data is used, the terms of use and the reliability of being able to access that data and to correct that data. Security, obviously, if you're locked in and you need to exit, do you get access to that data? What are the disaster recovery mechanisms? What backup provisions are there? Redundancy mechanisms. What I mean by redundancy is the second option. Redundancy doesn't mean you get rid of someone, it means provide an alternative in technology terms. Your own organisation's risk tolerance, and that'll depend on how big you are. For example, the risk tolerance of a law firm is somewhat a little bit different to the risk tolerance perhaps of a larger organisation, because a law firm relies on billable hours, and if they can't, they lose the advice that they're supposed to give to the client, they can use the client. But a larger organisation may have, more sophisticated backup mechanisms that they can use, something along those lines. And certainly they can retain the data, because you're engaging a service provider to help you store the data, but that doesn't mean that they can necessarily get copies and use it for their own purposes. So they're just some of the key risks. But when we're engaging when we're engaging the service provider to deploy the cloud, be it as an infrastructure platform or software being the most common, we do need to look at the contracts, so we need to look at the contracts quite slowly. We need to look at the contracts for two reasons. The first reason is obviously just the matter of law, that you're engaging with a party and you want to know, set like, understand the arrangements between the parties, but also you need to understand whether or not you're in the APP 8 accountability territory. So you've got to look at the standards of service, who owns the intellectual property, the service level agreement, so if something goes wrong, when will they contact you, when will they answer your call, when will they fix the issue, who's liable if something goes wrong, what kind of warranties and confidentiality obligations, how can you terminate the contract if something goes wrong, what kind of assurances do you get, breach obligations, can you do an audit, what's the jurisdiction that the contract is enforced in, and is it possible to find out the jurisdiction where the data is potentially housed, and obviously security requirements. You'll need to know, you'll need to know those issues in order to fully understand your obligations under APP 1, how you're going to describe the likely disclosure overseas of your privacy policy. You need to understand risk and contract obligations for APP 8. So, are you disclosing data overseas, or are you just using data? If you're just in the use territory, you don't need to put that in your privacy policy. You don't need to put that in your notification statement. It doesn't create an accountability mechanism under APP 8, and it also doesn't create substantial risk issues under APP 11. So, just to recap, I lost my holding. So, we need to understand, with respect to our data, we need to understand what risks are involved. What's our internal risk tolerance? How do we measure ourselves against the probability of the risk and the impact that that risk with respect to the data has on our business identification process. Then we look at the structure of the cloud that we're looking at. So how are we going to massage this data in the cloud environment? Obviously there's benefits and costs may well override. Look at the service model. Are we in the public-private space? And are you looking at the infrastructure platform software delivery? Look at your contract. What contract have you provided? Usually with IT contracts, the IT provider provides you with a contract rather than you draft it. But we still need to look at the key considerations within the contract. And then you need to measure the contract itself against your risk identification framework that you've set up. Make sure you understand, at least understand the jurisdiction of the contract as well, in case something goes wrong. Once you've done that, you can then identify and accurately know whether or not you need to describe any disclosures under your privacy policy for APP 1, under your notification statement for APP 5. Are you subject to the accountability provisions under APP 8, and how does it impact on your security obligations under APP 11? And once you're doing that, you need to always turn your mind to, is it a use or is it a disclosure? If it's a use, it's a lower hurdle, we're not in the APP 8 territory. If it's a disclosure, we are, and if it's a disclosure, again, we must put it in APP 1, 5, be mindful of also in 8, and be mindful about added security provisions in APP 11. So this is how I see them all coming together. There's always a lot of questions about data, and the object of today was to look at data from a cloud perspective, and so that we can talk about the issue of use versus disclosure. And if we're in the use space, it's a little bit easier to comply. If we're in the disclosure space, we've got more onerous obligations under ADMA. There's other avenues within ADMA to talk further about data. The border compliance obligations, we've done presentations on those, and they're on the Spotlight on Privacy website. We have a short course in privacy and marketing. We've got all sorts of resources in the Compliance Hub. Data Pass will take you from A to Z of data. It's actually, it takes the legal obligations, the particular day-to-day compliance obligations, and applies them to marketing and advertising. That goes through all the basics, and it's got a detailed module on every single privacy principle, and then they've got channel-specific modules within Data Passport, which will help answer a lot of the questions raised today. If you want to get involved in some of the regulatory committees, feel free to email me. We have a regular newsletter, and some chats and Twitter feeds. So there's other avenues and resources that we use in order to disclose, to talk about data. Today was just one of those in terms of the cloud and disclosing data. We get a lot of inquiries about that. So I'd like to thank you for taking time out of the morning to come to the offices of ADMA to talk about this subject matter. I'm grateful for your attendance, and I'm also very thankful for the very specific questions that I was asked. So if you need to talk to me